one of the main things I realized is I assumed until that moment that he would want the same things I would want in the same situation, which is not end up in the hospital all the time and not die from something that was preventable. And I realized that he must have some other motivation or needs or values that I was completely missing.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Breaking Bread, the podcast brought to you by Apostolic Christian Counseling and Family Services. Excellent to have you along, as always. And today I'm excited to have a conversation with Keyna Martinez. Welcome, Keyna,
to the
podcast. Please introduce yourself. Where do you live, your family? What church do you attend? Share.
So I attend the South Bend AC Church. That's where I was born and raised. I'm married to brother Joshua, and we have 4 boys, ages 18 to 11.
And Keyna, speak to your profession, because your profession has a lot to do with the insights you're going to be able to share with us here in this podcast. Yeah,
so I'm a family physician. I take care of people from all ages, from birth all the way through I think my oldest patient is in their late 90s right now. So all ages, all stages of life. And that has really taught me a lot about working with people who have sometimes pretty desperate needs or are in really difficult situations, and also people from a variety of backgrounds, different socioeconomic levels, different cultural lenses, different ethnic groups, all of which they bring with them into the exam room with the doctor. One of the things I've discovered about being a family physician is that a big part of my work is maintaining a relationship with patients. In medicine, we call it the therapeutic relationship. And the relationship is part of the therapy or the treatment by which we help to get patients better. So if we have a good therapeutic relationship, I can push or lean on my patients to get them to do difficult things like lose weight or quit smoking or take medication. And if the relationship is weak or poor or trust is broken, then I won't be able to help them be healthy. So one of the things I have learned in my job is the challenge of building and maintaining relationships with people who see the world differently than I do, who may have different expectations and values, and who many times really don't want to do what I'm going to have to ask them to do. People don't like to come to the doctor. At the best, they're hoping to escape with no bad news, but they're not really expecting a great experience. And so learning how to connect with individuals and hear them and understand why they make some of the decisions that they do is really important to helping them achieve healthy outcomes. Now, for us as Christians, there's a lot of similar lessons, except in trying to help people be physically healthy, we should be trying to help them become spiritually healthy. And that is part of discipleship. And it's got some of those same things. If we break the relationship, then it's harder to get individuals to want to move forward with a relationship with Christ. If they lose trust in us, who are his representatives here on earth, then that makes a bigger barrier to overcome them following Jesus in the future or wanting to grow in Christ themselves.
And so, Keyna, this experience really has pressed you into a ton of introspection into the workings of the human mind, right? To say, how can I connect with this person? Because I want to be able to motivate them to do certain things that are going to be maybe unpleasant. And so it's caused a lot of introspection. And I would add to that, I have appreciated the insights into even the way we operate as human beings and we react to things. And one word that you've used that I now use is playbook. Oh, this is what my playbook's telling me. And we kind of know what that term is in the sense of maybe sports and that type of thing. It's like, okay, this is how we respond in situations. And I'm going to ask you to really expand on this concept and help our listeners understand it and benefit it from it as well. But I would like you to go back, give us a caricature of your doctor's office where this concept really was given birth, and it really became solidified in your mind to say, this is what's going on, and I need to do I need to plow some ground here in my own life and heart to connect with patients.
So one thing that comes to mind is when I was in my training, so you finish medical school and then you do this intensive training that they call residency, which is where you get your specialty training. And so you're a doctor, but you still have a lot to learn, and you're really starting to practice the skills that you learned in medical school. So we had a patient who was struggling with cocaine addiction. And one of the things that cocaine can do is it'll raise people's blood pressure to astronomical levels, and they will have strokes and they will have heart failure. And so this particular individual was getting admitted to the hospital because he'd go into heart failure after using cocaine. And we'd have him in the hospital for a couple of days, and then he would, get better enough and he would leave. And then the next week he'd be back in. Now, as physicians, this is really frustrating. We're admitting this patient in the middle of the night. We're doing all of this care for him. We're serving him. We're pouring out for him. And the logic seems really obvious here. Why would you keep doing something that's going to land you in the hospital every week? And I remember having a conversation with him where I basically said, you do realize why you end up in the hospital. You use cocaine and it does this to you every single time. And I remember the look on his face, especially. And he didn't say anything, and he took very graciously what was basically a lecture from someone who really had no understanding of the pain he had been through in his life, the difficulty of the situation and circumstances in which he was living. And at the time, all I saw was someone who is hearing me, but we're really not connecting. We're not really communicating. I don't think he understands what I'm saying, even though the words would make sense. And I certainly do not understand where he's coming from. And I think that was the point at which I began to realize I'm missing something. I need something else to do my job well, to help me understand where people are coming from, because my assumptions about what's logical and makes sense to them is not working. There has to be some other piece of information I'm missing here. And I think that started me on the path of introspection, of saying, what don't I know? What am I not picking up on that would help me communicate or connect or understand, so that we can help people get out of these types of cycles of bad health or choices that impact them so negatively.
I think that's an excellent example where you looked and said, okay, I'm drawing some very clear conclusions here. And he's drawing different conclusions.
Well, and I think one of the main things I realized is I assumed until that moment that he would want the same things I would want in the same situation, which is not end up in the hospital all the time and not die from something that was preventable. And I realized that he must have some other motivation or needs or values that I was completely missing, because what I thought he should want clearly was not motivating enough for him. And it made me realize not everyone wants or expects or needs the same things that I do. And if I can't discover what those needs and wants and expectations are, then I'm going to give advice or recommendations or just misjudgments that will fall flat or be completely off or wrong.
Can you give another example of a misjudgment?
There are so many. So I'll give another one, and this one is less medical and more cultural, but it's something I found interesting. So my husband and I started having our children during my medical training. And so in my medical training, I was taking care of a lot of what we would call underserved individuals. So people who are more materially poor, typically a little more on the margins of society, many people who may be on food stamps or welfare or other forms of public aid. And I found a very interesting contrast between the ways that those individuals responded to my pregnancy and the kinds of questions that they would ask me. and the types of questions that educated middle-class individuals would ask. So, for instance, educated middle-class individuals tended to ask questions around things that we could talk about control or management of the pregnancy. For instance, was the pregnancy planned? Did we know the gender? And those types of planning and order and management of the timing and all of those types of things. Whereas my patients who did not come from a middle-class background, they never asked. It just wasn't even on their radar, anything about planning. It was more, what name are you going to name the baby? Things about, are you excited about the baby? What other kids do you have at home? They were just completely different questions. And I thought they revealed interesting insights into values that different cultures or socioeconomic groups might have. So, for instance, for many people living in a situation of material poverty, they often don't have a concept that anything in their life is under their control. So it wouldn't make sense to them to ask if a pregnancy was planned, because pregnancy is something that just happens to you. Whereas the middle class focuses a lot on planning and control
and future.
Yep.
People have different values in the way we understand time and the use of time and the importance of time. For example, that's the example you gave.
Yes.
What are some other, real tangibles? Like, I have found that people have different value systems on X, Y, or Z.
So a common one I run into is death. And what is the meaning of death in my work? So I have a number of patients that their goal is not to live as long as possible. Their goal is to die before they become disabled or a burden on others or have to accept the help of others. So it's a different perspective. They're not necessarily interested in living as long as they can. They're interested in their level of disability
and quality
of life as they age, and especially not becoming a financial or a care burden on their family and friends. That's a value that many of them have. I had one patient who was an immigrant from Africa. Most of her children were well established here in the United States, but she had been a nurse in Africa for most of her adult life, and now in her retirement was living here so she could be close to her children. And she had some problems with heart failure and was discharged from the hospital. And heart failure is a chronic condition. It's normally something that you take medication on a daily basis to keep things tuned up and functioning well. And in her mind, and she said this very clearly, medicine should not be taken daily for the rest of your life. Because she comes from a culture and environment where resources to be on medications indefinitely are simply not accessible or not available. And so in that culture and environment with the resources they have, medicine is used temporarily for salvageable things like an infection or a short course of treatment. And this was a point of struggle even, not just between her and her doctors, but between her and her children who wanted her to continue to be healthy, continue to be, the matriarch of the family and around. And she just had a very different value and felt that she would rather not be on medicine and die sooner than take medication because in her mind, there was just something wrong about living on medicine forever.
And just to pull back to the playbook, that's a perfect example. In her playbook, she didn't have a play. There was no play for medication every day for the rest of your life.
Correct. We should maybe go back and define a little bit what the playbook is. So different people who study neuropsychology, which is just the interplay between how our brain structurally and chemically works. So the things that we can measure and define very precisely scientifically, that would be the neuro part. And then the psychology part is how we think, the intangibles, feelings, emotions, thought processes, those types of things. And so neuropsychology combines those different aspects to try to understand how our brains work. And I think this understanding these things is actually incredibly helpful and insightful because when you see this pattern and what we have been able to understand about how God designed our mind, some of his rules and instructions in Scripture start to make a lot more sense. And you see that he has set up things really, truly for us to thrive and do well because he knows how we work. So the playbook can be called different things, but the basic premise is we have two different ways our minds make decisions. We have the conscious, intentional side of our brain that we're very aware of. And this is when you kind of make a decision about what you're going to cook for dinner, or you make a decision about, where you're going to go on vacation, or something where you're weighing the options and you're making a very deliberate, obvious choice. And that side we're very aware of, and we understand its workings pretty well because it only functions if we choose to engage it. But there is another side to our minds where we make decisions all the time, and that is our intuition or our instinct. It's an automatic process, and it just flows in the background of our mind. Without this, we would die. We would make foolish errors. We would run into danger. We would have all kinds of problems. We would forget, where the food is, and literally we would not be able to survive. So it's a very important part of our brain, but it operates completely in the background of our mind automatically. Now, the conscious part of our brain, we can use abstract information. I can give you a sheet of data with information on it, and it's very kind of external to ourselves in evaluating pros and cons and the different merits of different things. So it's kind of very concrete in that way. Whereas the playbook is basically using the sum of all our lived experiences plus a little bit of our own, maybe genetics or personality and biology. And it is using what we have experienced in the past as sort of a master reference for how we should respond to situations. So, for instance, a parent, and all of a sudden you have young children and you realize it's silent and you go, I better go find out what's going on.
Something's wrong.
That's your playbook saying, wait a minute, something doesn't line up here based on my previous experiences. When the children are quiet, something's happening, and I better check it out because maybe they're in the markers or in something worse. So the playbook uses what we've experienced before, especially if there are strong feelings associated with it, to help guide our future decisions. So a really good example, or an easy one for us to understand, would be a toddler and a hot stove. So a toddler can learn to never touch a hot stove by simply touching it once. Or if they go to touch it and their mother cries out with enough fear and surprise and fright in her voice, no, that little bit of her emotion will actually transfer to the child. So whether he's physically burned or he feels her distress through her voice, which is something we call mirroring, and without this, we would not be able to empathize or relate to people. So it's an important aspect of how God has designed us. So either through his own pain and distress in touching the stove or experiencing his mother's distress at the thought that her child will be burned and the expression and tone in her voice, the child will have a very negative, painful, either physically or emotionally, experience with that stove. He won't be able to explain it because he can't talk yet, and he won't be able to describe it to anybody. But if he gets close to that stove, he will get a bad feeling from his playbook telling him bad things happen when you get close to that. You should stay away.
And so the playbook is formed.
And that is how the playbook is formed. And it is especially formed with things that are highly emotional, especially if they're very negative emotions. So we are wired much more strongly to avoid pain and suffering and distress than we are motivated to seek pleasure and reward. So you may have an experience with someone which is mostly average and okay, or even beneficial if you kind of added up all the different moments and interactions and encounters. But if you have one or two very strong negative experiences, you may never trust that person. You may never get over the hurt that they caused. And you can forgive them and you can move on. But this is one of the reasons that we say, for instance, that trust is very easy to destroy and very hard to build back up again, because we remember in our playbooks the pain much more readily than the pleasure and the joy. this is not a bad thing. God designed it this way to help keep us alive. But it also means that it can influence us towards people and situations in ways that we may not be aware of or even acknowledge are playing a role. Sometimes even to the point of misjudging or mischaracterizing people. So one of the challenges or problems with our playbook is that it's right a lot of the time, and it makes life easy. We don't have to really think through things. We get this impulse to do something, and it feels right, and it seems right, and we just go with it, and we don't even think too much about it. And most of the time, things work out okay. So we trust our instinct. We trust our intuition. But it's not always right. Sometimes it's completely wrong. And when that happens, we either deflect and justify what we felt was right, or we feel a lot of distress because it is harder when we cannot trust or rely on our playbook. We all feel very comfortable in our own playbooks, and it feels right to us. And it usually works for us because our playbook is usually formed, by the environment in which we live. And the reality is very few of us leave the environment or culture in which we grew up. And staying in that environment or culture makes our playbook more helpful, more useful, more effective. We'll feel more confident about the decisions that we make, even if we can't explain them.
And reinforced.
And so one of the things is when we work with individuals who come from a different background than we do, we often start by assuming that they will want the things that we want, or that they will want the things that we think are valuable or important based on our playbook or background or culture. And we misunderstand just how much work it takes to transplant yourself out of an environment where your playbook can be relied upon most of the time into an environment where none of its rules are helpful anymore. And this is why so few people do make huge cultural shifts, because it's hard and it's very disorienting and it's very challenging to us, and it makes people extremely uncomfortable. So that's one thing, is just to realize how big of a step it is for someone, for instance, to move from poverty into the middle class. The other thing to realize is that just because we're used to something doesn't mean it's best for everyone. And so we get used to, this particular lifestyle or this, socioeconomic group that we're in, and we have these great reasons and justifications for why these particular choices are the best ones. But since that's all we know, it's not really a balanced perspective. It's very limited in scope. An individual from a different background or culture who has grown up in a very different way may look at our lifestyle and see problems. They may see stress. They may see relationships that superficially appear good but are not strong underneath. They may see consumerism or pursuit after wealth or status. And even from a Christian standpoint, they can look at what we might consider to be just middle-class values that everybody wants, right? And go, that's unchristian. That's not God-honoring. Look at the things that you say you're espousing. We do the same thing to other cultures. We look at the way they live and we say, wow, you're failing on this aspect or that aspect. And some of those criticisms are just as valid as the ones that others may notice about our culture or lifestyle. But recognizing that there's not one universal best outside of Jesus is an important step for us to make. So one of the wonderful things about Jesus and his ministry is that people from all walks of life found his message compelling and wanted to be part of his kingdom. He didn't just appeal to poor or to, what we would consider a stable middle class, the tradesmen and those people who had a farm or something like that. And he also didn't just appeal to the ruling elites and those who kind of had a place and a position in society. There were people from all walks who came and said, I want to make you my Lord and Savior. And the church early on carried that same tradition forward, where you have examples of house churches in Acts where they're meeting in a very wealthy home with people of status in the community and slaves, also part of the church, meeting together. And in Jesus, they found their common culture and strength, but it wasn't about conforming to a human or cultural ideal. It was about, in Jesus, we can find the unity that we seek.
And so there was a rewriting of Playbook.
Correct.
Part of the conversion experience was a rewriting of Playbook.
Right. And that's what our conversion experience should be, is we should say, okay, I have these values or these ideas or these ways of thinking or doing things, but Jesus says, be like me. And so part of becoming a Christian and part of the process of growing, or as Paul says, work out your own salvation. He's not saying through work we can be saved, but he is saying that God does expect us to bear fruit. And there are ways that we can work on that, and that is rewriting our playbook to bring it closer and closer into conformity with Jesus.
I'm going to cut in now on my conversation with Keyna. The power of the playbook has been made evident, and when we return, we're going to look at how we can rewrite those playbooks and the wonderful hope that lies therein. Thanks, each one, for being on.